They were the faces of the early 2000s. The black child stars who made us laugh, cry, and grow up with them. But then they disappeared. Not because of scandal, not because of failure, but because many of them chose something Hollywood never expects. A life beyond fame. So what really happened after the cameras stopped rolling? Stay with us, because the next names on this list might shock you. And by the end, you'll see why walking away may have been their greatest success. Let's begin. Joshua Washington, the boy who walked away. Joshua Washington didn't enter Hollywood quietly. He arrived in front of millions. At the start of the 2000s, audiences everywhere recognized his face. The confident kid with perfect comedic timing in Big Mama's House. A blockbuster, a cultural moment. Over $300 million worldwide. And there he was, standing beside stars twice his age, carrying scenes like he belonged there forever. For a child, that kind of spotlight feels like destiny. The cameras love him. Television welcomed him too. The Parkers, sitcom appearances, laughter packaged into prime time. Back then, it looked like the beginning of a long career, the kind that grows from childhood fame into adult superstardom. But Hollywood has a strange way of demanding more than talent. Because as Joshua got older, the roles didn't just ask him to act, they asked him to stay, to remain visible, to keep performing not only on screen, but in life. For strangers, for headlines, for an industry that rarely lets child stars become adults in peace. And then something unexpected happened. He stepped back. No scandal. No dramatic downfall. Just silence. As adolescence approached, Joshua chose something Hollywood almost never celebrates. Balance. Privacy. A life where success isn't measured in applause, but in breathing room. In freedom. In growing up without an audience watching every change. Today, he lives largely outside entertainment, a name remembered vividly by fans, yet absent from the machine that once pushed him forward. And maybe that's the real twist. Because Joshua Washington's story isn't about being forgotten. It's about choosing to disappear before fame decides who you're supposed to become. Sometimes the healthiest kind of success is walking away while you still can. Shavar Ross, the star who found a different calling. Shavar Ross was famous before most kids even understood what fame was. At just 9 years old, he stepped onto America's television screens and instantly became unforgettable. Dudley, the best friend on Different Strokes, standing in front of more than 20 million viewers every single week. That kind of exposure doesn't feel real. It feels like the world is watching you grow up in real time. And Shavar didn't stop there. He kept moving. Sitcoms, guest roles, films. Family Matters, The Jeffersons, even Friday the 13th. By the time he reached adulthood, he had stacked more than 100 credits, a resume most actors spend a lifetime chasing. For many child stars, that momentum becomes a trap, because Hollywood doesn't just reward you. It expects you to stay the same forever. But Shavar Ross didn't cling to the spotlight. Instead, as the industry shifted and opportunities changed, he did something rare. He looked beyond the camera and asked a deeper question. What is my life for when applause fades? And his answer wasn't another audition. He turned toward faith, toward purpose, toward community. He attended Bible school, eventually becoming a pastor in Los Angeles, spending years not entertaining millions, but serving the people right in front of him, not chasing fame, but offering guidance, not being a childhood memory, but becoming a real presence. And then he built something new, Triven Entertainment, a company dedicated to inspirational, family-centered storytelling, a quiet reinvention, not fueled by nostalgia, but by intention. Today, Shavar Ross is remembered not only as the kid America grew up with, but as proof that reinvention doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's dignified. Sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes the bravest thing a former star can do is step out of Hollywood's shadow and finally live in their own light. DJ Daniels, when the roles stopped coming. DJ Daniels became recognizable before he was old enough to understand what recognition costs. In the late 90s and early 2000s, he was everywhere. The quick-witted kid on the Hughleys, standing beside comedian D.L. Hughley as millions of households tuned in week after week. To audiences, he was effortless, funny, natural, A child star who seemed built for television. And for a moment, it looked like the path was clear. More sitcoms followed, guest appearances, even a role in the superhero film Sky High. DJ wasn't just a cute kid actor. He had range, timing, presence. But Hollywood has a brutal truth it never says out loud. Childhood fame doesn't come with adulthood guarantees. Because growing up in the industry is like aging out of a costume the world refuses to stop seeing you in. The roles that once arrived easily begin to disappear. And suddenly, the question becomes heavier than any script. Who are you when the spotlight moves on? For DJ, that shift wasn't smooth. Like many former child stars, his life briefly entered public controversy in the early 2010s. The kind of attention that follows you even when the truth clears your name. Court records ultimately confirmed he was not guilty, but Hollywood rarely gives people clean slates. So DJ did what survival often demands. He reinvented. He stepped away from acting, away from the expectations, away from being frozen in time as someone's childhood memory. And he turned to music under the name Boy Truth. He began releasing original work online, not chasing the same kind of fame, but carving out something that finally belonged to him. Because DJ Daniel's story isn't just about a kid who disappeared from TV. It's about what happens when the industry stops calling, and you realize you still have to keep going. Not as a character, not as a headline, but as a person trying to rebuild an identity beyond the roles that once defined you. And sometimes reinvention isn't a choice. It's the only way forward. Dee Dee Davis, the girl who left on her own terms. Dee Dee Davis didn't just appear on television. She owned it. In the early 2000s, she became a household name as Brianna, Baby Girl, Tompkins on the Bernie Mac Show, a sitcom that wasn't just popular, it was a cultural anchor. Millions tuned in every week. And Dee Dee, barely 5 years old, delivered lines with sharpness and emotional precision far beyond her age. She wasn't playing a child. She was stealing scenes from grown actors. Hollywood noticed immediately. Awards followed. A Young Artist Award in 2004. Guest roles on shows like House and Strong Medicine. Her future looked perfectly scripted. The next big star, the next long career, the next child actor who would make it forever. But life isn't a sitcom. And fame, especially for children, is rarely as bright as it looks on screen. Because behind the laughter, the industry carries an unspoken demand. Stay visible, stay marketable, stay young. And Dee Dee made a decision almost no one expects from someone so early in success. She stepped away. Around 2007, while her career was still full of momentum, she quietly left acting. Not because she couldn't continue, but because she didn't want to lose herself trying. Instead of chasing Hollywood longevity, she chose something radical: education, privacy, a life that didn't require applause to feel real. She attended school, went to college, and disappeared from the spotlight in the healthiest way possible, by choice, not by collapse. And that's what makes her story powerful. Because Dee Dee Davis didn't fade out. She exited on her own terms. In an industry that often consumes young talent until there's nothing left, her greatest role may have been the one she played off camera. A young woman who understood that sometimes the bravest success is knowing when to leave the stage before it takes something from you. And even now, years later, fans still remember her. Not because she stayed famous, but because she was unforgettable. Kamani Griffin, the child star who chose peace over pressure. Kamani Griffin was working before most kids could even spell the word career. In the early 2000s, his face became instantly familiar. The kind of child actor Hollywood trusted. The kind who could walk into a scene, deliver warmth, comedy, heart, and make it look effortless. His breakout came in Daddy Daycare in 2003, starring alongside Eddie Murphy. The film was a massive success, earning over $160 million worldwide. And Kamani wasn't just background noise. He was part of the charm that made audiences fall in love. Overnight, he became one of those young faces you expected to keep seeing. And Hollywood did keep calling. He anchored television too, playing Bobby James on All of Us for multiple seasons. He appeared in major series like ER, Grey's Anatomy, My Name is Earl, proof that he wasn't a one-hit child star but a steady presence. For a while, it looked like the industry had already decided his future. But fame moves fast when you're young. And growing up under constant visibility comes with a question most adults never have to answer. What kind of adulthood do you want when the world has already written your childhood? Kamani didn't crash. He didn't spiral. He simply stepped back. As he reached his late teens, he made a conscious decision to pull away from full-time acting, not out of failure, but out of self-preservation. He chose education, personal interests, and space to become more than just a former child star. He still returned occasionally, selective voice work, quiet creative moments, but never the relentless chase. Because Kamani Griffin's story isn't about someone who disappeared. It's about someone who protected his life before Hollywood could define it completely. In an industry that rewards constant exposure, he proved something rare. Stepping back doesn't erase your achievement. Sometimes it's how you keep it from destroying you. And maybe that's the real success. Not staying in the spotlight forever, but knowing when to leave it behind. Noah Gray KB, the genius who stepped away while still shining. Noah Gray KB wasn't just a child actor. He was something rarer. In the early 2000s, audiences met him as Franklin Mumford on My Wife and Kids. The brilliant, hilarious kid who could outsmart adults without ever losing his charm. The sitcom pulled in over 10 million viewers an episode at its peak, and Noah quickly became unforgettable. He wasn't playing a prodigy. He was one. Because off-screen, Noah's talent went far beyond television. Before most kids were learning multiplication, he was performing classical piano concerts, a real-life musical genius, not a scripted one. And then Hollywood expanded his reach even further. He landed a major role on NBC's global hit Heroes, playing Micah Sanders, a character seen by audiences in over 70 countries. At an age when most children are still figuring out who they are, Noah was already a worldwide name. The spotlight was wide open. The path to lifelong stardom was right there. But that's when Noah made a choice that felt almost impossible in Hollywood. He paused, not because he wasn't successful, but because he was. Because when you reach the peak that young, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Do you keep climbing, or do you stop and ask who you are without the applause? Noah stepped away while still in demand. He didn't wait for the industry to discard him. He didn't chase visibility just to stay relevant. Instead, he chose education, growth, and the freedom to define success beyond fame's narrow definition. Today, he lives largely outside the spotlight, remembered fondly, almost like a time capsule of early 2000s television. And his story carries a quiet kind of power. Sometimes maturity isn't staying on the stage. Sometimes strength is walking away before the world convinces you that being seen is the only way to matter. Noah Gray KB didn't disappear. He simply chose a life bigger than the roles he once played. Brandon Quinton Adams, the survivor of a Hollywood childhood. Brandon Quinton Adams wasn't just a child actor. He was a piece of an entire generation's childhood. Before the early 2000s even arrived, Brandon was already everywhere, appearing alongside Michael Jackson in Moonwalker, delivering haunting intensity in The People Under the Stairs, and winning over family audiences as Jesse Hall in The Mighty Ducks. Then came The Sandlot. Film after film, role after role. His resume was the kind most adult actors never touch. Hundreds of millions at the box office. Iconic coming-of-age stories that became permanent cultural memory. Brandon wasn't just famous. He was timeless. But Hollywood has a cruel pattern. It celebrates children and forgets what to do with them once they grow up. As Brandon entered adulthood, opportunities became less frequent. Not because his talent disappeared, but because the industry shifted and the space for former child stars began to shrink. And then life hit harder than any script ever could. In 2002, Brandon suffered a devastating personal loss. His close friend and fellow actor Merlin Santana was murdered. A moment that didn't just break headlines. It broke something deeper. For someone who had grown up inside the machine of entertainment, that kind of tragedy forces a reckoning. What is fame worth when real life takes everything away? Brandon didn't force a comeback. He didn't chase relevance for the sake of being seen. He stepped back, he reassessed, and in later years he returned only selectively, Voice acting work like Kingdom Hearts 2, narration projects, quiet creative contributions that didn't demand the spotlight, but still honored his craft. Because Brandon Quinton Adams' story isn't about a fallen star. It's about a survivor, someone who lived through Hollywood's impossible expectations and still held on to his identity. He reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't staying famous forever. It's making it out of childhood stardom without letting it consume you. Arthur Reggie III, the Nickelodeon star who knew when his story was enough. Arthur Reggie III didn't need a long career to leave a permanent mark. For many viewers, he will always be Alfie Parker, the heart of Nickelodeon's My Brother and Me, a mid-90s series that became a cult classic for kids who finally saw a black childhood centered with humor, warmth, and real family joy. The show only ran briefly, but his presence lasted for decades. Arthur had something effortless, expressive timing, natural charm, a relatability that made him feel like someone you actually knew. In an era where diverse youth storytelling was still rare, Alfie wasn't just a character. He was representation, and Hollywood opened its doors. Arthur appeared on beloved sitcoms like Martin Hangen with Mr. Cooper, Sliders. He even lent his voice to animation, proving he could move across formats with ease. For a young actor, the momentum was real. The path forward was obvious. But then, he stopped, not with drama, not with scandal, just a quiet decision. Because Arthur Reggie III did something most child stars are never encouraged to do. He recognized that his childhood success was already complete. And he asked a question that feels almost rebellious in Hollywood. If you already said something meaningful, do you really need to prove more? As the 90s closed, Arthur stepped away from acting to prioritize education and a private life, a choice that stood in sharp contrast to an industry that pressures young performers to remain visible at all costs. Today, he lives largely outside the public eye. Occasionally, he shares reflections with longtime fans, reminders that he hasn't vanished. He simply moved on, and his story carries a quiet truth that Hollywood rarely respects. Sometimes the most confident move is knowing when your chapter on screen has already said enough. Arthur Reggie III didn't disappear. He finished his story and walked away with it still intact. Ross Bagley, the kid who had it all, then let it go. Ross Bagley was famous before most kids even reached middle school. In the mid-90s, his face became instantly recognizable. First as Buckwheat in The Little Rascals, a family hit that played everywhere and grossed tens of millions worldwide. Then, Hollywood did what it always does when it finds a child star with charisma. It put him in history. Ross appeared in Independence Day alongside Will Smith, one of the highest-grossing films of all time, earning over $800 million globally. By the time he was 10 years old, Ross Bagley had already been part of 3 major cultural landmarks. And then came television. He joined the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as Nicky Banks during its later seasons, when the show was still pulling over 15 million viewers per episode. That's not just fame. That's childhood immortality. For most actors, that will become the foundation of a lifelong career. But Ross didn't build his adulthood on nostalgia. As he grew older, he didn't chase the spotlight or force a comeback. Instead, he stepped away, quietly, gradually, choosing education over auditions, growth over constant visibility. He enrolled at California State University, Northridge, studying cinema and television arts, learning the industry from behind the scenes instead of living trapped in front of it. And today, Ross Bagley lives a life far removed from Hollywood's glare. He works in real estate. He DJs in Los Angeles. He connects with fans occasionally, but he is no longer performing for the world. And that's what makes his story so powerful. Because Ross Bagley proves something most people never understand about fame. Walking away isn't failure. Sometimes, it's the most intentional kind of freedom. He didn't lose stardom. He simply refused to let it define his entire life. Ashley Amari Adams, the child star who let the spotlight stay in the past. Ashley Amari Adams became a familiar face before she was even old enough to understand what being recognized meant. In the mid-1990s, she landed the role of Cece Peterson on the family sitcom The Parenthood, a show that reached millions of homes each week and helped define a golden era of black family television. She began acting at just 4 years old. And on screen, she was pure warmth, lively expressions, natural confidence, the kind of child presence that made audiences smile without even realizing why. 4 or 5 seasons, she was part of something steady, comforting, and unforgettable. To viewers, it felt like she would grow up in Hollywood, that she would continue. That fame would simply stretch into adulthood. But childhood fame has a strange expiration date, because when the show ended in 1999, the industry moved forward the way it always does. Fast, forgetful, relentless. Ashley appeared in only a few more projects. Some voice work, a guest role years later on Girlfriends. And then she chose silence. Not because she couldn't chase the spotlight, but because she didn't want to. Because when childhood fame fades naturally, there's a choice Hollywood rarely talks about. Do you spend your life trying to bring it back? Or do you let it remain where it belongs? Ashley chose the second. She stepped away from entertainment, focusing on her personal life instead of public recognition. Today, she lives outside the industry, known more as a devoted mother than a former sitcom star. And her story is quieter than others. But that quiet is the point. Ashley Amari Adams reminds us that not every child actor's journey ends in tragedy or comeback. Sometimes it ends in peace. Sometimes the bravest thing is accepting that a moment in the spotlight can be beautiful, without needing to last forever. And for the viewers who remember her, CeCe Peterson will always remain a nostalgic touchstone, a reminder of a time when she helped bring horror to television, and then walked away before it asked for more. Brandon Hammond, the child actor who turned pain into purpose. Brandon Hammond wasn't the kind of child actor Hollywood used for charm. He was the kind they used for emotion. In the 1990s, Brandon delivered performances that carried weight far beyond his age, roles that weren't just about being cute or funny, but about surviving, grieving, feeling. His most unforgettable breakthrough came in Soul Food in 1997, where he played Ahmad, a young boy caught in the heartbreak and complexity of family loss. The film became a cornerstone of modern black cinema, earning over $43 million at the box office. And Brandon's performance? It wasn't just noticed, it was respected. He earned an NAACP Image Award nomination, something incredibly rare for a child actor, especially in a story that demanded depth instead of innocence. And Hollywood kept calling. He appeared in major films like Waiting to Exhale, Space Jam, Mars Attacks, sharing screens with some of the biggest names of the era. For a while, it seemed like Brandon was building something lasting. But then adulthood arrived, and the industry shifted. Opportunities changed, as they often do for child stars. And Brandon made a decision that wasn't loud, but was powerful. He stepped away, not in defeat, but in evolution, because he didn't disappear into nothing. He redirected. Instead of staying in front of the camera, Brandon moved behind it, becoming a filmmaker, a writer, and educator. He began telling stories from a different angle, directing short films, teaching media arts, shaping the next generation instead of chasing the spotlight for himself. He even worked on a documentary honoring the legacy of soul food, returning not as a child star, but as a creator with intention. And that's what makes his journey different. Brandon Hammond's story reminds us that longevity doesn't always mean staying famous. Sometimes longevity means growing into something deeper, because success isn't always about being seen. Sometimes it's about becoming the one who tells a story instead. Zelda Harris, the girl who chose a future bigger than fame. Zelda Harris entered the public eye before she was even a teenager, and somehow she carried herself like someone who already understood the world. In 1994, she gave a breakout performance in Spike Lee's Crooklyn, a film filled with emotional honesty, capturing black family life with a realism that stayed with audiences long after the credits rolled. Zelda played Troy Carmichael, and she wasn't just acting, she was living inside the story. Her performance was mature, grounded, unforgettable. Hollywood noticed immediately. Roles followed. The Babysitter's Club, You Got Game, each one proving she could handle complexity, not just childhood charm. She was building momentum, the kind of momentum that usually leads to decades of stardom. But Zelda made a choice that few child actors ever dared make. She stepped away, Not because she failed, but because she saw further. Because when you earn respect at young, the question becomes almost haunting. Do you spend your life proving it again, or do you build something beyond it? Zelda chose the second. Instead of chasing continued fame, she turned toward education, growth, and a future not defined by Hollywood's expectations. And then came the moment that stunned people who still remembered her as a child star. She graduated from Princeton University in 2007. Not a comeback, not a headline-grabbing reinvention, just a quiet, extraordinary commitment to life beyond acting. In adulthood, she pursued work in education and music, mentoring young people, performing with her band, building purpose in places cameras don't follow. And that's what makes Zelda Harris so powerful. Her story isn't about disappearing. It's about redefining success so completely that fame becomes only a footnote. Because Zelda reminds us, sometimes the greatest achievement isn't staying in the spotlight. It's having the courage to walk away and still become something remarkable. Cammie Davel, the Matilda star who chose control over fame. Cammie Davel became unforgettable in a single role. In 1996, audiences everywhere met her as Lavender in Matilda, the sharp, confident classmate who could steal attention even in a cast full of larger-than-life personalities. It was a family classic, the kind of movie that never truly disappears, because it keeps finding new generations through television, streaming, nostalgia. And Cammie's face became part of that timeless memory. Hollywood quickly embraced her. She appeared in major television shows like Moesha, The Steve Harvey Show, The Pretender, proving she wasn't just a one-time child actress, but a dependable young performer during the transition into the early 2000s. For a while, her path looked predictable. More roles, more visibility, more fame. But adolescence has a way of changing the script. And Cammie began to see what so many child stars don't realize until it's too late. The industry doesn't just demand talent. It demands your childhood. It demands constant access, constant presence. And Cammie chose something different. Instead of chasing nonstop recognition, she gradually stepped away from on-camera acting, not as an escape, but as a decision for creative control. She prioritized education. She built a life outside the machine. Cammie later graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in psychology, a choice that felt almost radical in an industry that rarely encourages young performers to become anything other than performers. And she didn't abandon storytelling. She transformed it. In adulthood, she moved into theater as a director and producer, taught acting to young performers, and even wrote her own screenplay. Today, most people wouldn't recognize her walking down the street, but her influence hasn't vanished. It has shifted behind the scenes. Cammie Davel's story is proof that impact doesn't always mean staying visible. Sometimes the strongest move a child star can make is stepping back and finally telling stories on their own terms. Emmanuel Lewis, the icon who refused to stay in novelty. Emmanuel Lewis wasn't just a child star. He was an era when he became the face of Webster. America didn't just watch him. They embraced him. The show began in the 1980s, but through constant syndication, it lived on throughout the 90s and early 2000s, introducing Emmanuel to generation after generation. At its peak, Webster pulled in over 12 million viewers per episode, and Emmanuel became instantly unforgettable. Small stature, expressive eyes, sharp comedic timing. A child actor who felt almost timeless. He wasn't just famous. He was iconic. Awards followed, recognition piled up, commercials, guest roles, global attention, even music. He released a single in Japan that gained real popularity, proving his reach extended far beyond American television. But fame can be dangerous when the world only wants one version of you, because as Emmanuel grew older, the industry didn't know what to do with him, except keep him frozen as a childhood novelty. And Emmanuel refused. He resisted the pressure to cling to fame just to remain visible. Instead, he chose something far rarer than another comeback: independence. He redirected his focus toward education, graduating from Clark Atlanta University with a degree in theater arts. He pursued discipline outside entertainment, earning a black belt in karate, building strength in ways cameras couldn't capture. And he founded his own production company, exploring creativity on his own terms, not Hollywood's. Today, Emmanuel Lewis lives largely outside the spotlight. But his legacy isn't just that he was remembered. It's that he refused to be trapped by what people remembered him as. Because Emmanuel's story proves something powerful. Real success isn't staying famous forever. Real success is growing up without letting the world turn your childhood into your cage. Dionne Richman, the child star who chose quiet evolution. Dionne Richman entered pop culture at an age when most kids are still invisible to the world. But Dionne wasn't invisible. He became known as Kenny, Bud, on The Cosby Show, one of the most dominant television series of its era. At its height, the show drew more than 25 million viewers per episode. That's not just fame. That's America watching you grow up in real time. His character was warm, funny, instantly lovable. And in 1989, Dionne received a Young Artist Award, early proof that he wasn't just a child on screen. He was talent. For many actors, a role that iconic becomes a trap. But Dionne refused to be locked into a single image. As he matured, he transitioned smoothly into new projects, appearing in Sister, Scream 3, Not Another Teen Movie, comedy, horror, teen satire. He proved adaptability across genres. And yet, even with steady work, Dionne didn't chase constant visibility. He didn't turn adulthood into a desperate reintroduction. Instead, he gradually reduced his on-screen presence, a quiet decision that contrasted with Hollywood's expectation that former child stars must endlessly remind the world they still exist. Because when your childhood role becomes legendary, the question becomes heavy. Is it easier to move forward or harder to escape what people already decided you are? Dionne chose reflection over reinvention for attention's sake. In later years, he shifted toward behind-the-scenes work, contributing as a producer and director, shaping stories instead of starring inside them. Today, Dionne Richman remains largely out of the spotlight, but his journey carries a powerful message. Longevity isn't always about being constantly seen. Sometimes longevity is about evolving quietly, with intention, without needing the world's permission to move on. These weren't just child stars. They were the faces of a generation, and their stories prove something Hollywood never wants to admit. Fame isn't always a dream. Sometimes, walking away is the real victory. So the question isn't whether they were forgotten, it's whether they escaped. If this made you see childhood stardom differently, stay with us, because there are even more untold journeys ahead. Like, subscribe and tell us which actors shock you the most.